Hi, this is Dr. Sana Hashmi. I'm a fellow at the Taiwan Asia Exchange Foundation. So, this week, a lot is happening in the India US relations, and a lot has happened in the recent time, and not much of it is actually good. For a number of years, there has been a very good transformation in the relationship, but in the past month, specifically after Trump's attempt for ceasefire, the relations have somewhat become problematic. So, from ceasefire attempts, credit to closeness to Pakistan, to tariffs, and to a series of accusatory social media posts for India, and then Trump is kind of pushing India to the margins. And India US relations are facing turbulent times. There is no doubt about that. As in, this is just not a perceived um, development, this is actually happening right now. And we have to wait and watch how much of this is going to impact the relationship, India's approach towards the US. But my this week in my print Eye on China column, I covered how is China watching this, and what are Chinese saying about this India US turbulent phase in the relationship. So, in my reading and in my understanding, they are actually cherishing it. So, this week, I have covered how Chinese media, strategic community, as well as social media users on a number of online platforms are viewing this drift and uncomfortable dynamics as something that is a crack in the wall, and that's a crack in the India US relationship. And in Beijing, there is absolutely a quiet satisfaction watching India US ties show signs of stress. And Chinese commentators see the Trump administration cozying up to Pakistan not just as a diplomatic pivot, but also as a proof that New Delhi misread Washington's intentions and Washington's objectives vis a vis Indo Pacific, vis a vis India, vis a vis China, India, and Pakistan. And for years, there has been an understanding that India and the US were seen as natural partners, which was this relationship was seen and still perhaps seen as a counterbalance to China's growing influence, aggression, and assertiveness in the Indo Pacific. But today, in Chinese discourse, this partnership is seen as fraying, and instead of strategic alignment, it is portrayed as shallow, reactive, and even fragile. So, Chinese media. They have been pushing a very clear narrative about this, and that is Washington is sidelining India. And if we look at the a number of articles on platforms such as Paito, such as Concha 163, there are headlines that are making waves. And I'll read out some of the headlines. For example, that US is now pursuing oil and mineral diplomacy with Pakistan while it is sidelining India. And then there are number of headlines like these everywhere, but the subtext here is that in Chinese discourse that India no longer holds the leverage it once believed it had vis-a-vis US and vis-a-vis US position in the Indo-Pacific. But I think, to be fair, it's just not about India's position in the Indo-Pacific. I think the US presence in the Indo-Pacific is also being diminished by its own self. So I don't think it's primarily, in my opinion, it's just not about India's influence getting diminished. It's U.S. influence getting diminished in the region, and but of course, Chinese discourse is primarily talking about India. There is this interest in China if India gets ahead and tries to cozy up to China. So I think we have to see it in a wider as a wider picture and from a broader perspective. So, from Beijing's perspective, Trump's renewed interest in mediating in the India-Pakistan tensions and then high-level U.S. military engagement with Pakistan. And even recently, Secretary of State Marco Rubio met with Pakistan Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister in Washington. So his outreach to Islamabad, all this is suggestive in Chinese discourse as a deliberate cooling off with New Delhi. As and also as one Chinese analyst put it, that Trump's erratic policies are not hurting China, but they're definitely hurting India. But in my opinion, it's also hurting the United States. So, in fact, one example that has been cited is the sharp reversal in US Pakistan ties. And some of the examples that are being given is that just a month after hitting Pakistan with tariffs, the US now began exploring a 8 trillion mineral venture in Balochistan. So for Beijing, that signals that Pakistan's value is being restored, is being revived in the US foreign policy, while India's space is shrinking. So there is this hyphenation in India Pakistan value strategic alignment with US in the Chinese discourse. Um, and Chinese analysts also argue that India misreading Washington signals and objectives escalated military action against Pakistan. So they actually is seeing Operation Sindoor, India-Pakistan conflict within the broader India-US relation. And then they still, in Chinese discourse, there is still this idea that India doesn't have its own agency and whatever it has been India doing is primarily being asked or bolstered by the US. So I think there is this misconception within the Chinese discourse. And according to their narrative, it backfired for India with Pakistan bolstered by Chinese arms, military and diplomatic support, and India's US weapon shipments delayed by the uh, long time. Beijing paints the result as military embarrassment and diplomatic isolation for India. So, even in social media discourse in China, they are actually going further. They are not really holding back either with respect to India. And one Weibo post read that Modi's lies are being exposed now, and Trump comments from social media posts are a slap in the face of Modi and India as he openly sides with Pakistan. So the consistent messaging from the Chinese side is that the US is prioritizing its own interest. So America first is actually coming first and not India's interest are at the forefront. And it will hedge, it will play both sides, and it will recalibrate as needed. So that makes India's position look brittle, stuck between an assertive China and an ambivalent America. So, in fact, India has also been called as a fence sitter, that India is actually not being trusted by both Washington and China in this equation. And India's strategic autonomy is one of the reasons why India is being treated like this by the US, and there is hardly any trust in China as well with respect to India. So, in fact, there's this another argument that there's a failure for India, where despite India's continued branding of Pakistan as a state sponsor of terrorism, the discourse in China states that India has failed to win Washington's unequivocal backing for this. And instead, the US seems to be reinvesting in Pakistan, and now that is complicating India's regional credibility, its regional influence. And in this context, an editor of Kwancha, Yang Rong, he argued that Trump era shift now marks a move away from the Biden era promise of India as a regional pillar, as a counterbalance to China in the Indo-Pacific. And there's another analyst, Liu Chenghui, who also said that, warned actually that any return between the US and China, which is going to happen eventually, would leave India even more exposed and India even more unsettled and uncomfortable. And then there is the broader narrative that China is the steady hand here and US is an unpredictable partner and a friend. India, they say, overestimated its strategic value to Washington, underestimated the cost of alienating China, and now is scrambling to recalibrate. Meanwhile, they believe that Pakistan is portrayed as balancing both powers far more effectively than India. Then, according to Shan Yi, who is a scholar from Fudan University, the US isn't a strategic partner for India. It is a power that will willingly undermine India's standing to maintain flexibility in the region. So, the consensus in Chinese strategic community in media is that India has been used by China, and India did not really read Washington clearly, and that is why India is paying the cost right now. And in the Chinese telling, the India US relationship is no longer a cornerstone of the Indo Pacific strategy. It's a cautionary tale of overreach, miscalculation, and strategic vulnerability. And in that story, US is not reliable, India is scrambling, and China sees itself as the only consistent winner in an increasingly fluid regional order. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next week.